A lot of controversy. John Kennedy Jr. and his sister, Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg, would not comment on camera. But Monday they released this letter, harshly criticizing their father's longtime secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, saying, "Mrs. Lincoln took advantage of her position by taking countless objects that had belonged to our father and to the U.S. government. In so doing, she breached both the public trust and that of our family." Among other things, the Kennedys charge Lincoln kept the briefcase and the watch their father had when he was killed. They want several items back for the family and for the Kennedy Presidential Library. Kennedy loyalists defend the family claim.
Well, there are several items that have been consigned for the auction that belong to the nation.
But the auction house says Mrs. Lincoln collected presidential memorabilia that only now have historical value, and she did so with the president's approval.
She'd say it should be saved, and she would be given the object.
By all accounts, Evelyn Lincoln kept everything she could relating to President Kennedy. When she died in 1995, she willed her Kennedy memorabilia to a longtime friend, a cleaning supply salesman. Now, Robert White claims he has every right to put the items on the auction block. Meanwhile, on Monday, an agreement was reached with the auction house to turn over several items to the National Archives. A writing desk Kennedy often used, and 20 documents, notes the president made on foreign policy. The auction runs through Thursday and is expected to bring in at least $5 million for some priceless memories the Kennedy family thinks should not be for sale. For today, Rahima Ellis, NBC News, New York.
Robert White is the man who's put about 300 of the items up for auction. He's with his attorney, Robert Adler. Gentlemen, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Mr. White, I'd imagine you're getting more bad publicity from this auction than you'd bargained for. Do you understand why people, including the Kennedy children, are so up in arms about these items being sold?
I guess I can understand that a little bit, but I've collected and archived this material myself for over 40 years, and it's my life savings. I've put my heart and soul into it, and I do want a museum to honor JFK.
You say you've collected over 40 years, but Evelyn Lincoln, the president's personal secretary, did keep some items, and there are those who say she had no right to do that. How do you respond to that?
I truly believe that Evelyn Lincoln was herself a preservationalist. She saved things from extinction, and I think that's the most important thing that everyone is missing here. If it wasn't for Evelyn Lincoln, we wouldn't have any of this material today.
So you're saying that if President Kennedy were alive today, he would approve of the fact that Miss Lincoln kept these items?
Absolutely. Mrs. Lincoln shared also a lot of oral history with me, and the fact that Mrs. Lincoln got these things even from the president. In the auction is a small note from a control officer directing that officer to give something to Mrs. Lincoln for her collection.
You have returned a love letter written by Jackie to JFK to Caroline Kennedy. There are other items that have been turned over to the National Archives. Is there negotiation going on now over other items in this collection?
Yes, there is. And we're very, very positive about the negotiations, and we're looking forward to settling all of this.
Mr. Adler, maybe you can shed some light on that for me. How are the negotiations going? What items are involved?
There is a discrete list of items that the Kennedy family members say they would like to have. I was on the phone last night till midnight with their lawyer. We started again at 6 o'clock this morning. I trust there will be a settlement sometime this morning.
Would you like to put your client, Mr. White, and the Kennedy children together face-to-face to discuss this?
That subject has never come up. We're not that far apart. There are 5 or 6 items, and it's good old-fashioned horse trading in terms of who ends up with what. And when you get that close, this thing will settle.
If you don't come to a deal, though, there are reports that the Kennedy children will sue you if this auction goes on as planned. How will you handle that, Mr. White?
This whole thing is disturbing from one aspect to me, and that's the downplay of Evelyn Lincoln's role and chastising her in any way. I have a wonderful team behind me, and we'll address that as it happens. But I keep very close to this, and I really believe that this will settle.
And briefly, you'll take some of the proceeds from this auction, and you'll take it for your personal use, but also you say you'd like to take some other items and start a museum. There is already the Kennedy Library in Boston. Why not just donate the items to that?
This is my life's work. I've worked for several museums. I've archived this material. I love this material, and I really, really hope that and pray that I could get up in the morning and go to my own museum honoring JFK. I think that this country is big enough for 2 museums, and I am in no way competing with the library. I'd like to work with them.
Robert White, Robert Adler, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ted Sorensen was a speechwriter for President Kennedy. Mr. Sorensen, good morning to you. You knew him, you worked with him. How do you think he'd feel about this?
I think he would be outraged. His personal materials and property belonging to the government is being auctioned off by someone for his own personal profit.
Do you think these items, do you consider them stolen?
Let's put it this way. I feel sorry for Mrs. Lincoln, who was a devoted secretary to President Kennedy. I don't think she knew what she was doing when she took property that belonged to the family, belonged to the estate, and belonged to the government. But yes, it was misappropriated. Yes, it was taken by someone who did not own, had no right to it. And I think you've raised a good point, Matt. People who go to this auction should remember that in New York, if you acquire stolen property, you have no rights at all.
Legally, though, it would be almost impossible to prove that these items were indeed stolen.
Oh, do you think so? Do you think that there's one chance in 10 million that the president gave his expensive men's watch that he was with him when he was killed in Dallas to Mrs. Lincoln?
What about the assertion of Mr. White, who says that the president often gave her items and said, yes, take this, Miss Lincoln?
His briefcase that he was carrying with him in Dallas, his personal diaries and journals. Of course he gave her souvenirs and scraps and drafts of papers and so on. There are thousands of things like that circulating out there. Some of them are false and some of them are real. But he certainly did not give to Mrs. Lincoln the items that are being disputed.
So who should control these items? Should the Kennedy family control them? Should the National Archives control them? Should the Kennedy Library control them?
Well, it's all according to law. The government documents and government objects, such as the clock in the Oval Office, clearly belong to the government. Of course they go to the archives. The Kennedy Library, I should add, is part of the government archives. There's a replication of the Oval Office in the Kennedy Library. I hope you've seen it. It's a wonderful educational tool. That's where that clock should be. On the other hand, personal items, personal family items were left in John F. Kennedy's will to his family, and that's who should have them.
Mr. White has spent a lot of money over the past 40 years collecting these. Should he just be left in the lurch? Should he be not compensated for any of his work, his time, and his effort?
Well, with all due respect to Mr. White, it's too bad that he has let his greed outrun his admiration for the Kennedys, because those who do not have good title cannot convey good title. Mrs. Lincoln had no good title to these properties. Mr. White, I think, knew that when he either purchased some items from Mrs. Lincoln or induced her to give or bequeath him the other items.
The auction is scheduled just a couple of hours from now.
We'll see. We'll see.
Do you think there's
I
a
hope
chance it'll
there's
be
a settlement. I have no idea about the negotiations, but it's hard for me to imagine that the state of New York permits an auction of stolen property.
You'd like to see the auction boycotted?
There are some items there. I see there's a rocking chair there. Well, that's wonderful. I have a rocking chair, too. Hundreds of people have rocking chairs that look exactly like the Kennedy rocking chair. There's a cigar box that has John F. Kennedy's name on it. Who knows who put that name on it? People can buy all that stuff they want to buy.
Ted Sorensen, thanks very much.
Thank you.
7:50, we're back in a moment. This is Today on NBC.